Hi, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. I'm Dr. Marie McNeely, and I appreciate you joining me today for episode 768 with our guest, Dr. Fiona or Boo Maisels. Listeners, if you like this episode and you want to check out more stories from amazing people doing great science today, you can find more episodes of our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you like to listen. And today, Boo has some phenomenal stories to share about her life and her science. So get ready to meet another one of our brilliant people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Fiona or Boo Maisels. So, Boo, welcome to the show today. How are you?
I'm good.
Well, Boo, we are thrilled to have you with us today, and I'm looking forward to learning more about you and the work that you're doing. But first, let me tell our listeners a little bit more about you and how you got to where you are today. So listeners, Boo is a conservation scientist with the Wildlife Conservation Society, or WCS. She's also an honorary professor of biological and environmental sciences in the African Forest Ecology Group at the University of Stirling in Scotland. Boo completed her PhD and postdoctoral fellowship at Edinburgh University, and she's worked as a conservation scientist since then in the Central African Tropical Forest region. Now, Boo is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, and she also previously served as an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh and the University of Stirling. And today, Boo, we want to get to know you both as a scientist, of course, but also as a person more generally. So what do you like to do when you're not very busy with science and research and conservation?
Mainly walking about, looking at natural stuff, hills or flowers or birds or trees or anything that's alive, really.
Oh, wonderful. Do you have favorite walking routes or places you like to walk?
Well, at the moment, I'm in a city in Scotland, Edinburgh, and we do have quite a lot of nice green spaces here. But it's more interesting to go into forests. This is why I did science anyway. Mm-hmm. It's doing something fun during my life.
Absolutely. I think getting out there and exploring the world is a great source of inspiration, as well as sort of just clearing your head at the end of a busy day. So I'd love to talk about the science that you do, Boo. So how do you describe your work to someone who may not be familiar with conservation or the specific projects you've been involved in?
I try to understand what's going on in the natural world and try to understand the interactions between things that go on. I mean, most of my work has been interactions between plants and animals. And in the more recent decades as a conservation scientist, it's the interactions between people and landscapes, wildlife, species in general. So that's the first thing, just understanding the interactions. And then the second thing as a conservation scientist is how can we do something about it? If something's going wrong, what are the drivers of things that are going wrong? And then that helps us to identify things that we can do about it, I guess.
Very interesting. And I know, Boo, that your work has spanned a wide range of species. Can you give us a sense of the range?
I started off on feral sheep in Europe, and then I moved to Africa and I worked on gorillas and a whole suite of monkey species and elephants with a little bit of birds and plants thrown in around that.
I love it. Well, I look forward to learning more about some of the work that you've done over the years. But I'd love to start our conversations by talking about motivation. I think as a scientist, sometimes you need a little extra motivation, particularly maybe in conservation, where sometimes the outcomes look grim. So do you have a favorite quote or a saying or something that really just keeps you motivated and inspired, Boo?
Well, I guess that's very American. But I guess I bore my friends by saying a day without learning something is a day wasted. And they all go, oh, boo. But no, I mean, not really. That's just life in general.
Well, I love this mentality of continuous learning because I think that's something that as a scientist, I still feel like I'm learning something new every day. Is this something you do, at least maybe on the back burner, try to incorporate in your everyday life?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I say, oh, thank you for telling me that. It's my day not wasted.
I love that. And I think also another thing that can be really motivational or inspiring are the people that you're surrounded by as a scientist. So But when you think back about your own career, or maybe your own life in general, do you have particular role models or mentors or people who really helped you get to where you are today?
I think the person I looked up to most, even before I had anything to do with wildlife conservation as a job, was George Schaller, who coincidentally was in WCS for many, many years. But he combined very careful data collection with fieldwork in some of the most wonderful places in the world, some of which I've worked in now. And I can remember that when I did join WCS, and then I would see him at talks and so on, and one of the things that he said to somebody who was suggesting a hunch that they had, he said, "But you have no data." So he always wanted everything to be evidence-based, and I really, really respected that. And I think that's the only way we can really operate into the future. Otherwise, there's lots and lots of claims made about conservation activities, but they haven't got any basis in evidence. So that's the only way that we can do things that we know are going to work.
Absolutely. I think that's critical as well, because oftentimes there are limited resources. So you have to think about what will be the most effective plan that you can put into action.
Yeah.
Certainly. Well, you mentioned that your journey started with studying feral sheep, and I'd love to talk more about this journey. Maybe we could walk it back all the way to the beginning. You mentioned that you were sort of inspired by this conservation scientist before you even got involved in or started thinking about conservation. But what sparked your interest in science more generally, Boo?
I'm just interested in wildlife and looking at things and wondering how everything works. And then I did zoology at university, and then I did a master's in resource management because I thought that that's what you needed to run protected areas. And then I realized, well, actually, a master's in resource management tells you how to deal with people more than it does actually the resources. And I wasn't very good at that. So I went back to academia from the wildlife point of view, if you like, which is when I did the wild sheep thing. So that was looking at a species of feral sheep that had been imported by Neolithic people to the island of Cyprus. And they imported it as an animal to be hunted. It wasn't a domesticated animal. And in the centuries, thousands of years since then, it had kind of subspeciated and was still hunted to the point that it was almost extinct. And then hunting was banned, and then the population went up a bit, but nobody knew anything about it. So I asked the forestry department in Cyprus if they would support me to do a PhD, and they said, "Oh, yes, we don't know anything about it." So that was great. And then I got an academic post as a postdoc after that, still with the same University of Edinburgh, to Gabon, to look at gorilla feeding ecology. And that went reasonably well. And then following that, I got a fellowship from the Royal Society, which is a British institution. And it was affiliated with the EU, which gave me a place in any EU university that I wanted to do. So I joined the University of Rennes, which is a French university, to work on monkey ecology in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I think in those days it was still Zaire. And then I went to Gabon as part of that same work. And after that fellowship finished, I then moved to the science wing of the conservation world. So I did short contracts, about 1 or 2 years with BirdLife and with the EU, and then very short contracts with IUCN and WWF, 3 or 6 months. And then I got a post in WCS in 1999. So I think that I'm 25 years now with WCS. So the first post was in Congo, and I was 5 years at quite a famous place in Congo. It's called the Nuabali Ndoki National Park. I was the research director there. And then after that, I got a regional remit to look at priority setting and monitoring across the whole of Central Africa and general science, which is what I still do. It's really, really interesting.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, Boo. And I think for scientists who are on their career journeys today, it may not be obvious sort of how to make these connections and get these kinds of positions like yours. So how did you originally get connected with the WCS?
I was working in BirdLife, which is in Cameroon. I was the project ecologist. And that was a 2-year contract, and it was coming to an end. And I had organized a couple of monitoring meetings in Cameroon, and somebody from WCS Cameroon was moving to Congo, and he wasn't a biologist. I think he was a forensic anthropologist by training. And WCS New York said, well, see if you can't hire a biologist. And so he'd already met me through the whole monitoring network. And he said, do you want to go and work in northern Congo? And I said, yep. So we drove all the way across Cameroon, got in a dugout canoe, and a few hours later, we landed in Congo. And that was that for the next 5 years. Just super.
I think that's wonderful. And it sounds like you've been having a wonderful time in this position. You mentioned it's been about 25 years there with the WCS. What has it been like working with this organization?
Well, I knew beforehand. I'd done a very short contract with WCS before doing vegetation mapping in another site in northern Congo. And I knew WCS had a whole bunch of scientists on their books, that they had this evidence-based ethos of doing conservation, as I mentioned right at the beginning of our talk. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a great place for a conservation scientist to sit, because you can suggest things that people will listen to in terms of finding out if things are going to work.
Absolutely. I think being able to do work that you can see has some real world impacts, I think must be really fulfilling as well.
Yeah. I mean, before I moved to the NGO side, when I was doing the academic stuff, we were working in a site in Zaire, and then there was kind of a revolution in 1991. And within 6 months, all the monkeys that were habituated by that project had all been shot. So I thought, well, okay, we're not actually helping. If you habituate a lot of animals and then you can't stay at the site forever, then they will get shot. So no matter how much information you collect about the ecology of an animal, if you can't conserve them afterwards, it's not very useful. It's all very nice for producing papers and so on. But the main issue is decline of wildlife and decline of habitats. So moving into the science part of the NGO world, I think, is more helpful for me anyway, than just staying in the university world. Although, as you've mentioned at the beginning, I'm affiliated with a university here in Scotland that has got this African Ecology Group, but most of the work that we do has got a conservation focus.
Absolutely. And I think you are doing some remarkable work in the conservation field. So I'd love to talk about some of the current projects that you've got going on. So Boo, is there a particular project that you've been working on lately that you were the most excited about that you want to share with us today?
Yeah. In 2017, other colleagues, not WCS, developed a method of counting animals using camera traps that didn't require that the animals were striped or spotted, because before that, we know we can use capture-recapture to count things like tigers and zebras and okapi and anything that has got markings on their bodies that allow the individuals to be recognized. Okay, so, tiger number 1, tiger number 2, tiger number 3 are different from each other. But what about all those animals that are uniformly colored, or you can't distinguish them, which form the bulk of the prey of the carnivores of the world? And they also, in Central Africa and a lot of forested areas of Latin America, they form the prey of people. People in rural areas very often depend on hunting, and they tend to eat, large rodents like agouti or forest antelopes, which we call duikers in Central Africa. And there hasn't been an easy or relatively cheap way of counting those animals until now. And the way that the camera trap distance sampling works is you just lay out a grid of cameras across a large area, and you leave them for a couple of months, and then you go and collect the cameras, and then you use something called distance sampling, which is a well-known method for walking line transects. You use the same mathematical basis of distance sampling to count the animals. So now we can get a handle on these undistinguishable animals, like the agoutis or duikers. We also can get a handle on animals that are nocturnal and don't leave obvious signs. So colleagues have already got an estimate for the density of giant pangolin, for example. And we can also look at animals that are quite rare, even if they're not nocturnal, like golden cats, which are an African wild cat that are actually diurnal, but nobody ever sees them because they're so rare. They're not as rare as leopards, but with the camera traps, the cameras are sitting there for 24 hours a day for, weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. So far more likely to see an animal than a human crashing through the vegetation. So that's the most interesting, cool thing that I've been involved in recently. So now we've done a study in Papua New Guinea, a study in Madagascar, 2 studies in Congo, and a study with WCS Latin America in Bolivia. And the data for that is currently being analysed. And yeah, it's a cool new method. And hopefully it can be rolled out across the world. It's most useful at the moment in forests, but there are ways of tweaking it so it can be used in savannas as well.
I think that is so cool. Now, with these cameras, I imagine, you said you kind of put them in place for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. Do cameras ever go missing? Like, did the animals somehow make off with the cameras in any of these cases? Or for the most part, are you able to recover them every time?
We buy a steel box and a steel camera that goes with every camera. Before we did that, we had one camera that was actually transformed from a 3-dimensional object to a 2-dimensional object by an elephant.
Oh, no.
And very occasionally some got stolen, or people would just steal the batteries and the SD cards, which are more useful to people than an actual camera. But yeah, the steel box works, the cable works. And importantly, if you're working in a permanent site and you know the local communities, it usually is enough to go and see the leaders of the local communities and say, hey, we're going to do a big study. There's going to be cameras in the forest. It's all part of our regular wildlife censusing work. Please leave them alone. And that generally works.
Very good. I'm glad to hear the security measures are panning out. But I think you sort of alluded to the fact that there are challenges with the work that you're doing, of course. And I think these are very common in science, but people don't necessarily always get to hear about the challenges, the struggles, the failures. So, Boo, do you have an example of a time that you had a major failure in your career, or just you really struggled with something that you could walk us through and talk about how you got through that difficult time?
I think the general issues are humidity. It messes up a lot of electronic equipment. And there's also the remoteness of some of the places where we work. Sometimes it takes a really long time for equipment to travel from a shop in London or New York to somewhere in the middle of the forest somewhere. I guess, we all had to leave free in 1991 when there was a civil war, but we had a research station with the University of Rennes in France in the middle of what was then Zaire. And that research station was looking at a combination of monkey ecology and plant ecology. And then I think the sequence of events was something like, in 1989, the wall came down, the Berlin Wall came down, and Russia was no longer a very powerful mover and shaker across the world. And so they lost their grip on places like Angola and Mozambique. And with that, the international funding that went to countries that were theoretically against Russia formed a kind of barrier. And one of those was then Zaire. Funding to that country stopped from the outside world. And when the funding stopped, it meant the army were no longer paid. So the army are the people with the guns. So they went on a wee riot in the capital, and local people thought, they started rioting as well. There was lots and lots of riots across the whole of the country. And so our project had to close down in a hurry. And we all went away to Rwanda. We just went across the border, which was hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and waited. And after a couple of weeks, it became quite clear that that was that, and there was not going to be any order restored very quickly. So we had to close the project. The person who was administering the project went back every 3 months to check and to pay the staff. And eventually it all just got closed down and the whole project got moved to Gabon, which was much more stable country.
Interesting. I think that brings up a really important point of just sort of these political considerations because of the international nature of the work that you do that, like you said, people may not necessarily think about when you're just excited about the science of the project.
Yes, because the daily work at the site was going into the forest every day and following a bunch of habituated monkeys around and recording what they ate. It had absolutely no international feeling about it at all. But then we were, impacted by things completely beyond our control, and with this domino effect of the change in geopolitics across the globe. But that was a long time ago, and I'm sure this kind of thing is still happening all over the place, but it hasn't happened personally to me recently.
Absolutely. And I'm glad to hear that you were able to at least kind of move the project and continue it in another country in Gabon. And I think being able to sort of pick yourself up after these challenges and failures and sort of keep going in science is really important. And you need to take a moment to celebrate these successes, because I think oftentimes these successes are few and far between, unfortunately, but we love to talk about whether it's the big wins or even just these small but particularly meaningful victories. So, Boo, do you have a favorite success story that you can share with us today?
The most recent thing is we published a paper in Nature a couple of weeks ago, which looked at the effects of good forest management or good forestry management on the wildlife living within the forests. In Central Africa, timber companies don't clear cut like they do in Europe or USA. They do something called selective logging. So they only extract a couple of individual trees per hectare, because there's lots of different species, but only a few of them are marketable outside of the immediate area within which they grow, mainly because they're very good hardwoods for furniture. So some companies, mainly European companies, have signed up to something called the Forest Stewardship Council certification scheme. And it's kind of a green label. If a company abides by social and conservation norms during its daily activities of logging, it will get a certificate which allows the buyer, you and me, buying a chair in our local hardware shop, to know that it's come from a forest that's been well managed. So we know it's pretty easy to check whether social norms are being abided by, because when an audit team goes into each concession, they check, are people wearing their hard hats? Are they wearing protective clothing when they're cutting down trees? Is there a school or a hospital provided by the company? What's less easy to prove is whether there are more or less wildlife than in areas that don't have that kind of certification. So this was spearheaded by a very interesting and interested PhD student called Yuri Zverts from the University of Utrecht. I was one of his advisors, and he selected 7 pairs of forestry concessions across Gabon and Congo. One of the members of each pair was FSC certified, and the other member of each pair wasn't. It was just a random logging concession. But he chose them carefully so that there were not other differences. They both had the same habitat. They both were in the same geographical area. They were both the same distance from the nearest road or town, because, of course, the main pressure on the wildlife in this area is hunting for meat or ivory, where elephants are concerned. And he used camera traps as well. And he used the camera trap rate, the number of pictures of each species per day, if you like, as the metric of abundance. And it was outrageously clear that in the FSC managed concessions, there were far more elephants, gorillas, chimpanzees, buffalo, large-bodied ungulates than in the other non-FSC managed sites. But in the 2 types of management, there was the same abundance of rodents. And this is because people who go hunting for ivory, obviously they're selecting for the elephants, and people who go hunting for the commercial meat market, they pick the largest animals to kill, because that's the best cost benefit. One bullet can either kill one monkey or it can kill a very large animal, like a gorilla or a buffalo or a pig. So it makes sense to shoot the large animals first. And so it showed that FSC management was actually pretty good as a conservation tool, that the wildlife in these types of logging concessions was pretty much what you would expect for a healthy forest, so that when you or I as an individual go and buy our chair, we can be satisfied that not only the staff and the communities living in those concessions are being correctly treated, but also that the wildlife within those concessions is very lightly impacted, if at all, compared to the other types of concessions. So that's very cool. At the moment, it's only been done within Central Africa, within 2 countries. It would be very nice for it to be done across other parts of the world, because FSC is in Europe, North America, Latin America as well. So that would be pretty cool.
Absolutely. And now that you have some kind of hard data behind the arguments here, what does the future look like for these FSC managed sites?
As long as the buyers care and are willing to pay the extra 5 or 10% for the wood, then that's an incentive to the companies to maintain this kind of management.
Oh, I think that's very cool. And then perhaps we can also squeeze in discussion about the Colobus Monkey Project. I think that is another cool success that you've had recently. So we have time to talk about both if you'd like to.
Okay. In 2021, people who do research and conservation on colobus monkeys, red colobus monkeys across the whole of Africa, got together and wrote an action plan for it's 18 different taxa of red colobus monkeys. Now, these animals, they're like 10 kilos. They're big. Whatever that is in pounds, it's like 20 pounds or something. And it's not that they're not very bright. It's that they don't appear to run away from hunters very much. And they're quite noisy. So if you're a hunter and you're out to get as much meat as possible to sell, you can hear them from quite a long distance away. And they kind of make noises like rubber ducks squeaking, bath rubber ducks.
Mm-hmm.
And you can make your way to those animals and they don't rush away and they don't sneak away silently like some other species of monkey do. So one of the first species within any forest to disappear when access becomes easier to humans are the red colobus monkeys. So the result is that all of the existing taxa are endangered on the IUCN Red List, which is an international measure of whether animals are threatened or not. And they can act as umbrella species or flagship species. If you've got red colobus in your forest, it's unlikely that there's a lot of hunting going on in most of Africa. There are some areas where monkeys are not eaten by people, like parts of East Africa. But in parts of East Africa, the reason that animals are becoming rarer tends to be more deforestation, or at least forest animals are becoming rarer rather than hunting. But in Central Africa, it's very much a hunting issue. The deforestation in Central Africa is one of the lowest across the globe. There was a phrase called the empty forest that was coined by Kent Redford in 1992. And it means a forest where, for example, you can fly over it with a drone or a small plane and it looks fine and the canopy's intact, but you go underneath it and there's no animals left. So the first step to an empty forest is the removal of red colobus monkeys. So the action plan identified the places where there still were these animals and the best actions to conserve them. And then the ideas from that were then transformed into a published paper that will be more widely read than an action plan. Action plans are great for individual sites to guide people on the activities to do within the sites or within a country. Published papers are better to get it out to the policy forming communities, the decision makers across the world, not just in the sites themselves. So it was published, I think it was 2 weeks ago. So hopefully it will have an effect of encouraging people to see these monkeys as umbrella species and to think about what they can do to conserve them, which also has the effect of conserving everything else as well under the forest canopy.
Certainly. And I know there are 17 different species of red colobus, and you mentioned it's sort of a broad habitat range all the way from, the west in Senegal to the east. So is the strategy or maybe the best actions to conserve these monkeys the same across species and areas, or is it sort of differ depending on which species and where they are?
Well, it depends if they're endangered by hunting or by deforestation. The action plan outlines the individual actions required at each site, yeah. The paper more outlines the need to do something. I think that's the best way of putting it. They can be an umbrella species wherever they occur, but the activities that one should do are different according to the site.
Oh, certainly, that makes sense. And I think, Boo, these projects that you've described are absolutely fascinating, and they have a lot of potential to impact these communities and just in general biodiversity. This is something that we're seeing sort of slipping in the world as a whole. So I appreciate you doing this work. And I think being involved in such important conservation efforts can be very motivating, but also it can motivate you to sort of dedicate more and more and more time to these projects. And we know that this is a challenge in science, sort of building that work-life balance in. And we always recommend that our listeners take a break, try to give their minds a break, think about something different. And one way to do that is reading broadly. So, Boo, do you have a favorite book or one that you've read lately that you've enjoyed that you can tell us about and recommend for everyone?
Well, it sounds a bit trivial, but I really enjoyed a book called The Power of the Dog by Don Winslow, which has absolutely nothing to do with science.
Mm-hmm.
It's looking at the interface between the drug cartels in Central America and North America and European connections and the US. And the reason I like it is it's super detailed. It covers 30 years. It's very closely based on what actually happened, except it's been fictionalized. And the author is very careful, and he spent 6 years researching it. So I was impressed by that. But nothing to do with science, really. And anything by Cormac McCarthy, really, because of the language. I don't know, very hard stories, but written in the most beautiful language. And both are American authors. I suppose I should be choosing somebody from Europe.
We're honored by your recommendations. Well, thank you for these recommendations. We will add the author, of course, Cormac McCarthy, to our website, as well as the individual book, The Power of the Dog. I love these kind of historical-based fiction books as well, so I'll have to pick it up myself. And we've talked about some different aspects of your work, Boo, and one thing that's come up quite a few times are all of the places that you've been for the science that you do. And I think this is a perk about careers in science. You get to travel for conferences and other things, but also specifically a lot of the field work that you do gives you travel opportunities. So do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you?
Not really, but I'll tell you about the most recent trip, which was in April. 2 colleagues and I went to Bolivia to teach this new method that I mentioned earlier, camera trap distance sampling, to teach the analysis of the data. We had already been, this is a WCS project that invited us. They had already asked us about the methodology, and without actually going there, we sent the protocols and the relevant scientific papers that had been published on it and a couple of videos that we'd made on how to do it in the field. And so we got 20 people coming across from all countries in Latin America where WCS is based. And we worked on data from the Bolivia program that they had collected. And that was fantastic. A big group of massively competent and interesting people in La Paz. And so that was really, really fun. And then at the weekend after the conference, after the workshop, we went out to the high Andes with WCS Bolivia staff, and we saw all sorts of new stuff. I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time just on holidays in Ecuador and Nicaragua, but this was the first time I'd been to Bolivia for 25 years. And we saw vicuñas, we saw vizcachas, we saw lots of new birds. The coolest thing about the vicuña was that this is an animal that's used for its extremely soft and fine wool. It's probably the wild ancestor of the alpaca. And they used to be killed in rather large numbers, and the wool was sold to the very fine fiber markets in Europe. And WCS started a project in Western Bolivia in a site where there was only about 100 left, and worked with the communities to catch them every couple of years and to shear them, just like sheep get sheared, in the part of the year when it's nice and warm and the animals aren't going to suffer from the cold, and then to let them go again. That initiative was started, I think, 20 years ago, and now they're from 100 animals, they're up to about 12 or 14,000 animals. And, communities are getting a lot of money from selling the wool, and the animals are still there in much greater numbers than they were before. So it's a fantastic success story, and I was super impressed. They're completely wild, they're completely wild animals. They just get caught every couple of years.
Well, you make it sound easy, but I'm sure it's a bit of an ordeal trying to catch all these wild vicuña. But I think such a wonderful solution to this problem where, like you said, the community was dependent upon them for, the fibers, but also you want to make sure you're preserving those animals in the wild. And it must have been wonderful to be able to see those in the wild while you were in Bolivia.
Yeah, they're really beautiful. They've got very sweet faces as well.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing some of your travel stories with us today. And I think one of the other things that's wonderful about careers in science are the people you get to work with. We highlighted just, some of the amazing people that you've worked with on these different projects over the years. But I think people don't often think of scientists as these fun, creative, amazing people doing cool stuff every day. You sort of have this picture in the media oftentimes of these white lab coated people sort of mixing things in test tubes. And I think that's not what science is for so many scientists I know. So do you have an example, Boo, of maybe a tradition or just a funny memory that you've shared with colleagues or something that you do every day that goes against some of the stereotypes that people have about scientists and life as a scientist?
Well, I mean, we don't work in labs in my part of science. We mostly work in forests or back in the office with the computer. But a lot of my colleagues, they play music. One guy is a magician. A couple of people do, quite high-level sport, black belt judo, that kind of thing. One woman was a sculptor before she came into science. So, yeah, we're just people who do lots of different things like everybody else. In WCS, there was a little band for a while, a couple of guys on guitars and a singer and a drummer, and they were all scientists. So, yeah, we're just normal people.
Now, are you a musician or do you have a hidden hobby yourself, Boo?
I can play about 4 chords on a guitar.
It counts.
But I don't do it anywhere else except my living room.
Well, I think that's wonderful. And I absolutely agree that a lot of the people that I've met who are scientists have these other aspects of their life. It's not just all science all the time. And I know in science, you're doing amazing work as well as in conservation, but oftentimes things limit you, whether it's funding, the staff, the technology, the time, the feasibility, or maybe a combination of all of the above. But if we took away these barriers, Boo, is there one question, maybe one problem that you would want to address most?
I think the most important issues in the world at the moment, we kind of need to do something about them rather than finding out more about them at the moment. So it's not so much a research question, it's how do you convince people in general and governments in particular to implement policies that will actually change things. You can look at that for climate change issues, you can look at that for plastic pollution issues, you can look at that for pandemic type of issues. I think probably the most important issues are social science rather than conservation research at this stage. How do you convince people to change their behavior? Because for the most part, we know what's going wrong and we know why. For the really big issues, I think that behavior change is probably the main thing.
So from your perspective then in conservation and all the experiences that you have, do you have maybe an example of something that has worked particularly well for convincing people on a particular project?
For health, when I was a kid, everybody smoked cigarettes.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't anymore. What helped there was health information, but I don't know how specifically that health information was transmitted to all the people who smoked. I think we could probably learn a lot of lessons from that because we don't seem to be doing a very good job of convincing people not to do things that damage the world because the world is going to crash and burn in flames in terms of the 8 billion people on the planet. But maybe we can convince people from a personal health point of view. That might work. So if your village is going to be flooded in 50 years, you just kind of get on with life. But if you're going to get incredibly sick this year because of something, then you might change your behavior.
Absolutely. I think focusing on those immediate impacts where you know it's going to impact the people during their lifetime can be really impactful and powerful. Well, we appreciate you sharing your insights and your stories with us today. I would love to end with advice. So, Boo, do you have one piece of advice that somebody gave you at some point that really helped you that you could share with listeners today?
It's probably something along the lines of, you think this is only happening to you, this bad thing or this difficult thing, but actually it's happened to so many other people in the past and they got through it. So perhaps that is something, everything ends and things get better. I think that's perhaps the best advice.
I think that's wonderful advice, Boo, and I appreciate you sharing that with us today. And I think that can be helpful for listeners out there who might be struggling with their own, whether it's personal problems, scientific problems, just to know that they're not alone. Other people have made it through the struggle before. And I'd love to end with one last piece of advice or a note of inspiration. So is there any last message you'd like to share with listeners out there?
I think, again, I'll go back to, there's something called a shifting baseline effect in science, whereby people think that what they see around them is what's always been the case. So, oh, I'm excited to see a butterfly today, or how nice it is that I've seen 3 queen bumblebees looking for nests last weekend. But 20, 30 years ago, there would have been hundreds of those animals just around. And 100 or 200 years ago, there would have been thousands. So I think it's partly because people don't look outside very much anymore compared to what they used to. Children used to spend all day outside, even in town situations, and they don't anymore. So I think get outside, look at stuff, look at the animals, look at the plants, look at growing and living things, and kind of get used to living your life outside 4 walls. I think that's probably one way of becoming more aware of what's around you. It doesn't help the shifting baseline, but it makes you be able to understand that things can change without you being aware of it, maybe.
I think that is a phenomenal note to end on. I think so important to step away from our computer screens and our quiet little offices, get outside and see the world. So, Boo, thank you so much for speaking with us today. If our listeners want to learn more about you and the work that you're doing, what is the best way for them to do so?
Well, they can have a look on the WCS. We have websites. Some of them are country associated. Some of them are more general. There's WCS News on Twitter. And then if you're scientifically minded, just go and have a look for stuff that I've written online. Just Google me, I suppose, on Google Scholar or Web of Science or anything like that.
Perfect. Well, listeners, definitely check out those resources. Take some time to learn more about Boo and the work that she and her colleagues are doing. And Boo, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
I hope if it manages to, encourage people to do more for conservation. That's the main thing.
Oh, absolutely. And listeners, we appreciate you joining us for this conversation today as well. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and we hope you'll join us again in our next episode of People Behind the Science.